Okay, I have noon here in California. I know it's later almost everywhere else, but might have a few people here from west of me, not very many. So I'm Paula McElwee, and I'm hosting this call today. I'm an older woman with silver hair and blue eyes and a Scottish complexion. I'm wearing a wrap because it feels cold to me here in California today. It's probably 60, you know? We haven't turned our heat on yet. We try to avoid it for as long as we can, usually past Thanksgiving. So we use blankets and stuff, and I like it because I like the cold. So welcome, everyone. This is the Financial Managers Call. And we have changed a couple of things for the, kind of reference of those of you who are new or not. One of the things we're doing now is a monthly call. So that's a change. We used to do quarterly calls, and you all said, no, you wanted to talk more often than that. And then you also indicated that you wanted to do a topical call, have me present a little information, and then discuss it among yourselves. And so that's the plan. And the topic today is around getting through an audit partly, but also around allowable and non-allowable costs. We are recording the first part of the call, the presentation portion of the call. We will turn the recording off for the discussion part of the call, just because we want you to be fully comfortable with sharing with your peers whatever's going on, and what your questions are and so forth. So we're not recording the second part of the call. The first part of the call will probably be posted unless there's some reason why it doesn't work out well. And so it will probably be posted shortly. I do have the chat up in front of me, but it's hard to really notice it when you're running a slideshow. So if I miss it, we're a small enough group, just unmute and jump in, okay? You can do that during this first presentation part, but it will be recorded if you do. And then you can save it, or you can save it for the conversation, which will happen. This first part's not going to take very long. It's just a few basics. So surviving funder and other audits has to do often with how you communicate with the reviewer during the audit itself. Now that has a lot of, it can look a lot of different ways, because some of these audits are now being done remotely. So people are saying, send us your financial statements, send us your billings for this time period, send us this or that. Then they're documents that you send off in response to a request, but they're not necessarily fully reviewed and discussed, because you're not looking at them together like we used to do all the time when people came on site. Now, some people still are coming on site. Your state funder especially often is coming on site. But the federal funders are doing many reviews right now. If you haven't been picked up yet, don't be surprised if you are. And most of those are remote to begin with, and then they do go on site if they feel a need to. They are coming back to me, the funders, and saying, oh my, we've got a mess. People don't know what they're doing. Now, what my experience is with you all is that your level of what you know and how you describe it and how you work with it is different at a wide range, just like the size of your centers are different, so some of you have some of you are the executive directors and you're contracting for all of your fiscal stuff, and others of you are full-time fiscal people in larger centers and everything in between. And so your experience is different for each of your centers, and that's okay. As we talk about this, if something doesn't make sense for your center, please don't hesitate to tell me why, and we'll and just jump in and we'll do what we can to address that. But our experience is that during that conversation, if you understand the key concepts, the most basic pieces, then you have a better result with the funders when they audit your programs. And of course, that's our desired outcome, is the very best result when they do an audit. Now, the key areas that you need to be knowledgeable about include allowable and non-allowable costs, because you can't charge non-allowable costs to the federal grant. So you need to know, what is it that the feds say you can't spend federal money on? What are those allowable and non-allowable things? And there are some that are pretty, we'll go through them in a little detail, but that are pretty consistent, that come up in the conversation, and you might need to rationalize about why you do something in a certain way. That's one of the pieces. Internal controls of the federal rewards is another one. And that includes, making sure that, well, I'll go over a few more details, but making sure that one person isn't in charge of it all, that other people have a role in reviewing pieces of it, so that there's always a second set of eyes looking at all of your key financial information. And then we'll also talk about how you document your costs and how you allocate your costs. So you have to have good documentation, but you also, when you share a cost between two different funding sources, you have to have a process for allocating that, which has probably been our most popular topic. And then the procurement requirements, which have become at the federal level very, I don't know if the word is generous or, anyway, you don't have to have approval at a pretty high level, but your state may have a different set of requirements, and your center may have more restrictive requirements yet. And so you need to follow your own procurement requirements, even though the federal procurement requirements have become quite, quite manageable or quite easy to manage. And then also your staff needs to know what your policies say about all this stuff, because you have policies around what's allowable and what isn't. You have internal control policies. You have policies about how you document things, and you have policies about how you purchase things. And of course, you need to follow your own policies at a minimum. So those are some things that you need to know when you survive an audit. Now, here are some tips for looking at your policies, because these are the things I'm finding the most. First of all, if your policies mention EDGAR or RSA, they're out of date. That's an old reference. So if you see that in your policies, you need to update your policies because they're out of date. EDGAR is the Department of Education, and we're no longer in the Department of Education. We're in the Department of Health and Human Services. RSA doesn't oversee our programs. Well, who oversees our programs is now ACL, or the Administration on Community Living, rather than the Rehabilitation Services Administration. So those references are no good. Here's some more references that are out of date. OMB circulars 110, 122, and 123 no longer exist. So if you're referencing those in your written fiscal policies, you need to update them to instead talk about either 45 CFR 75 or 2 CFR 200. Now, we don't care which. They're both current and they're almost identical. If you only have IL funding, 45 CFR 75 is probably the reference you want, because that's the one that ACL, our funder, Administration on Community Living, does. But if you have other funding sources, funding streams, you may want to use the 2 CFR 200 because it crosses over all the different federal departments. So if you're doing an employment program through RSA, and you're doing this IL program through ACL, 2 CFR 200 is a reference that fits both. It was called the super circular because it combined those other circulars up there, those OMB circulars, not just those 3, but others. And those are the references for it. So those are the references that should appear in your policies. And if you've got those other references, then they're not current. Now, any regulation that starts with 36 UF Code of Regulations no longer applies, because 36 is EDGAR. Remember, Department of Ed, we don't do that. Ours are found in 45 CFR 1326. I know I'm giving a lot of numbers, sorry. Or in 29 US Code And then there's some other numbers, but 796 is typically where you look. So notice, first of all, are your policies current? And I see a lot that are not. Now, if you're not certain about how to do this, one of the things I can do, I'm slowest at this. I can give you advice quick, but when it comes to reviewing documents, I'm slower. But you can send them to me and I can look at them and I can highlight the parts that need updated or make suggestions or whatever. But number one, you're going to be checked when they audit you about whether or not you're following your own policies. So your policies need to be up to date. Internal controls related to federal funding, you've heard it said, if you didn't document, you didn't do it. And that's true, whether it's an agency-wide or specifically related to a specific contract or grant, you need to document your processes. You need to have receipts for things. You know, I saw it wasn't a center, but another nonprofit. Excuse me, I got to let my dog out. I saw that my husband had locked him in and I thought, oh no, he's going to want out just as soon as I start this call. Sorry about that. So when it comes to internal controls, that's true. If you didn't document it, you didn't do it. And I was going to tell you about a nonprofit where I was working with the auditor who was going through the records, and the auditor said, I've got no receipts for any of these credit card charges. So all I've got is the credit card receipt that lists the vendor and the amount, but of course it doesn't tell what the purchase was or what its purpose was. And he said, you know, this is a problem. What are we going to do? Because we can't prove that this was an appropriate purchase because all we've got is a vendor name. So true, isn't it? So you've got to actually be able to document that you purchased a certain thing. So that's also true, but for establishing a proper control environment, you want to make sure that it's in place. And if you aren't doing something to look at and monitor your environment, then you can't prove that you are following the requirements of the grants. So it's true for performing a risk assessment, establishing control activities, communicating your policies and procedures to your board and to your staff, putting those control activities in place, and then monitoring whether or not you're doing it. Now, auditors who come in to perform compliance audits are required to look at your controls over compliance. And part of that is the money. And so you can expect ACL and other funder auditors to ask for your documentation. Actually look at what you are doing in order to provide internal controls. And yes, Katie, the PowerPoint will be shared afterwards. It'll be posted online. This recorded part, we're not going to post the other part. So in order to determine if a cost is allowed, these are the requirements. It has to be necessary to the performance of the grant. And so if you've got something that's not related to IL that you want to purchase, you really need to ask yourself, is it necessary under this requirement? Because if it's not part of that grant and what's expected of that grant, then it's difficult to justify it. Also, it has to be a reasonable cost. That's where your procurement, you know, checking prices and so forth comes in, and we'll cover that in a minute. It has to be allocable, meaning if it's a shared cost, you have to be able to split it out and share it between your funding sources. It has to conform with federal law and grant terms. So there are some things in the grant terms that we'll talk about briefly. It has to be consistent with your local and state policies. So as I mentioned, the requirement for when you get bids at the federal level is quite high. At the state level, it might be lower. So you don't even have to look at checking prices until it's a purchase of over $10,000 at the federal level. But at the state level, it might be $500. So you need to know what those requirements are at the state level, and then also within your own policies at your center. Your board may want you to do checking of prices at a lower level, even than the state does. But whatever you do, you have to do it consistently. You have to always treat it the same way. You can't decide today, oh, this cost is going to be shared by these 3 grants. And then tomorrow decide, oh yeah, this grant really can't afford it, so I'm going to only split it between these 2. You can't go back and forth. You have to make a decision and you have to follow that requirement consistently. It also has to match GAAP, which your accountant is aware of. If you're not an accountant, you're someone is aware of that. Your grant costs can't be matching costs for other federal required grants. So you can't use federal money to match federal money to draw down more federal money. That's not an option. Net of applicable credits, I don't fully understand that one. But I put it in there because it's in the list of the stuff that they say in these regulations. But I think what that means is you can't take credits and treat them as if they're separate income. The credits to the grant have to be treated as part of the grant. And of course, that documentation, when there it is again. Now, documentation doesn't have to all be paper, although often it is with this kind of thing, because I bring back the receipt from the trip or the store. It can all be documented electronically, but it has to be documented one way or the other. So here are those terms again: reasonable, necessary, allocable. And these have to be true of every purchase with a federal grant. So a cost is this is their definition, so it's kind of techie sounding, but a cost is reasonable if in its nature and amount it does not exceed that which would be incurred by a prudent person under the circumstances prevailing at the time the decision was made. Now, I think this is a good place to talk about some of those CARES Act fund purchases. There were a lot of things that we were able to do with CARES Act funds that we weren't able to do before those dollars came down. And whether or not those costs exceeded what would be incurred by a prudent person kind of depended on the demand. So there was a time when some related things like masks and other things were more expensive than others, more difficult to get. So for a period of time, that cost may have been higher. Does that make sense? So because a prudent person was still willing to pay for it because of the circumstances, and it was a cost that was reasonable within the area, but then that cost came down and it became more reasonable. And of course, then we changed how we purchased. It has to be necessary to the purposes of the project, which in the case of your Part C or Part B money is the purpose of Title VII of the Rehab Act, which we go over a lot, but it has to do with changing the world to be more independent, at least. So, and then allocable. It's allocable if the goods or services are charged or assigned to that award in accordance with the relative benefits. So if 100% of the benefit is to your Part C grant, then 100% of the cost should be charged to your Part C grant. But if only 80% is used by your Part C grant and 20% is used by your Part B grant, then you need to have a method for splitting those costs or sharing those costs. And we've gone through a lot of the details about this method and how it works and how it's incurred. And it's not, it's individualized. It's not, it would almost be easier if they told us we could only do it one way. But they don't. They have us all do an individual plan. And so with your individual indirect cost rate plan, then you have to follow that in order to allocate your costs across all of your funding sources. And you need to make sure that it's a sign that it makes sense, that your proposal made sense. So when you look at allocating costs, that is something I suggest that you set up right in your books once you've got your plan put in place. Why wouldn't you go into that bill? Let's say it's your rent bill. You already know what percentage goes to what grant. So why wouldn't you go ahead and go in there and set up that bill to be allocated the way that you said you were going to allocate it? So that when you go in and write your rent check, it's already split between your funding sources, the way that you said you would do it in your cost allocation or indirect cost rate plan. Okay. Unallowable costs, let's just hit these real fast. Alcoholic beverages are never allowed. Doesn't matter what your purpose is or how you do it. Never. Bad debts are never allowed. So if you inherit a situation where money is owed to somebody. Now, I have seen a couple of situations where somebody, your predecessor, did not keep good records, just paid the bills and drew down, a loan to pay the bills and did not take the time to properly charge them back to grants. And then the new person walks in and has this debt. If it's within the same year and sometimes even within 2 years, and you can go back and fix what they didn't do, which is correctly charge it, then you still have the ability to do that. It's not really a bad debt until you've written it off as something you can't charge to your grants. So if you have somebody who's just messed up the entry of the information and you can go back through and recover the bills, remember that documentation has to be there, and show how it was to be charged to each grant, then you can go back and do that and you can pay off the borrowed money with the grant in that case only. But you can't do past debts or bad debts where you were determined to have spent the money on a big beer bash and you weren't supposed to, and so they're going to mark it as not allowed and you have to pay it back. You can't do that, but you can sometimes do the necessary hard work to fix the bad mistakes of your predecessor, and that is sometimes workable. Some advertising isn't allowed. So, you have to think about, okay, are we allowed to advertise for new staff? Absolutely. So what do you need to do to recruit people with disabilities to be part of your organization? Outreach is allowed, but you're not allowed to advertise for things that are not related to your project. So advertising related to, something that you're going to do that's unrelated to your project would be not allowed. You're not allowed to give money to somebody else. So I once saw a situation where everybody had a gala in the state. Well, at least a half a dozen people, centers in the state had a big gala, and they were charging, I don't know, $250 a plate or something for this big gala. And so the executive director at this center over here said, well, I'll come over to your gala and I'll buy 10 tickets. And then you come over to my gala and buy 10 tickets and then we'll all benefit, right? No, you don't get to donate or make contributions with federal money to somebody else, even if it's a center and you want to support them. That's not allowed. Most entertainment is not allowed. Sometimes people have entertainment as a part of those galas. Typically those parties with the high plate dinners and the auctions and the entertainment, dances, so on and so forth, typically those need to support themselves, and typically you cannot use the federal funds for that. You can't use federal funds to pay fines and penalties. You can use federal funds to pay interest. So if you've got a credit card you can't pay off, you don't want to let it build up a fine or a penalty for you, but you can go ahead and carry the balance and pay the interest if you have to, and that is allowed. So hopefully that makes sense. And lobbying is not allowed, so you can't ask legislators to behave in a certain way. You can't do that. A couple of other things on allowable and not allowable. Conferences are in that list. And so when you go into the regulations, I've given you the reference there. Conferences for educational programs are allowable as costs for programs the organization develops. And so sometimes the state has tried to interfere with that with Part B funding and say, no, you can't use your Part B funding to pay to go to the April conference or the Nickel conference. Well, that really is allowed in your regulations. And so you need to be able to look at this reference and say, no, the state doesn't get to tell us that we don't get to do that. So that's an important piece. Depreciation may be allowed, depending on the useful life of the asset, but it's not allowed for land. And it's not allowed for equipment that's funded or donated by the federal government. You can't depreciate that. And equipment used especially for a non-federal contract, you can't purchase that and then use it for a non-federal contract and depreciate it on your grant. But you can fund your depreciation on other things. Legal defense costs, generally not allowable if the litigation is initiated by any government entity under the False Claims Act. So if you or your predecessor or somebody in the past tried to pull down money and it was determined that it was not allowed, that they claimed falsely and did it intentionally to defraud the government, then you can't pay for those legal defense costs. You can't pay for the legal defense costs by a current or former employee who submitted a whistleblower complaint of retaliation or reprisal. Now that can come back around once it's settled. If it's found that you weren't guilty of that, then you can go back and pay for that funding, but during the process you cannot. And if the claim relates to a violation or a failure to comply with regulations, and it results in a criminal conviction or a finding of misconduct or an order to take corrective action or a debarment or a suspension, if any of those are your outcomes, those are some bad outcomes there, then your legal defense costs were not allowable. And so if you paid for your legal defense costs, you might have to go in and fix that, and pay that back to the federal government. No. What I always say to people is do some good planning with legal costs. So why not have someone review your policies and procedures for personnel before somebody who's an employee tries to sue you? Why not pay for an attorney up front to look at that so that you already know whether or not your policies and procedures meet your state law. And that varies so much state to state that we don't present you with sample personnel policies. Typically we say share among yourselves within the state. But as you look at it, why not do the preventative piece with your attorney rather than waiting until something happens and then it's not going to be allowed. But the planning is allowed. The development of policy or the review of policy is allowed. And then even if the parties settle, legal fees are often not allowable. And there's a possibility of allowability for proceedings by state, local, federal government, or foreign governments with only specific written approval. So presumably that would be when the federal government didn't find it to be a violation, but someone else did, that's in the chain or in the process. Now, I don't understand all the details of this, but I think it's important whenever you've got something legal cooking to go back and look at this section and that legal defense. This is all found in that 45 CFR 75.430. And I think it's worth looking back at anytime you're considering a legal cost. But like I said, the preventative stuff is usually good. The development of good policies and procedures, so do it, right? Make that happen. General legal and professional costs are allowable, as I just mentioned, especially with individuals providing the service have a specialized skill, and you need to pay them in order to have the benefit of their expertise. Other factors that affect the allowability of legal and other costs include the nature and scope of the service, whether or not you needed to use a contractor, which typically you do because most of you don't have legal staff on board. Some do, but that's not their area of expertise, right? So it's not personnel law or whatever. The qualifications of the outside service provider and their customary fees and how significant the federal funding is to you, those all may be factors as you decide how is this allowable or not allowable. Okay, one more kind of topic, and then I need to get you to the discussion here shortly, has to do with the methods of collection and transmission and storage of information. As I mentioned earlier, it can be paper. It does not have to be paper. It can be electronic. It can be scanned, or it can be sent to you by your vendor as an electronic record. You need to know how you store it and how you can access it, and how you can send it on. If somebody asks for this documentation after the fact, do you have it? And is it transmittable? And all of those are important, but it can be either paper or electronic is the bottom line. So that's the last one on that. Let's see. Click to exit, it says. Gonna let me exit? Stop sharing. Yay. All right. Whew. Questions, comments? I'm going to stop the recording, and then we can, if I can figure out how to do that. There it is.